Welcome to Jet Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today, I am here with Yerachmiel Stern, the CEO of Pesach Tikvah, the only or largest Orthodox mental health institution really in the world. So, Yerachmiel, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, I want to start just with a question. Most of my listeners probably are not from an Orthodox background. Just for full disclosure, I grew up in the Orthodox community, so I think I understand it sociologically a little bit better. The Orthodox Jewish community and mental health don't seem to be very synonymous. In other words, I can imagine a lot of pushback in the Orthodox community for some sort of outside mental health. Why not just talk to a rabbi or, a trusted charuta slash study partner? So, how much do you brush up against this tension between, Orthodoxy and, outside mental health experts?
Right. So I've been with the organization about 16 plus years. And when I first started, this was a huge issue. This was people were just so resistant and adverse to therapy, both in a clinic setting, both privately less because it was hush hush, if you will. But as the years have gone on, the stigma has dimmed a little bit, especially now post COVID. Mental health has been so openly spoken about and so mainstream that, people breathe that in and they're just like more okay with it. Not perfect, not perfectly okay with it, but more okay with it. And so things have gotten easier in that regard, but it's still a battle. It's still a battle today, but it's a different battle today than it was a decade ago. So, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, mental health is interesting from other areas of health because Judaism has a lot more to say in theory about mental health, right? If I break my arm, there's very little in the Torah and Gemara slash Talmud about how to solve that, but there is a lengthy Jewish history of how to achieve your potential, obviously, how to deal with emotions. Maimonides, the Rambam, writes a lot about this, even how to achieve happiness and what that looks like. So is your sense that the hesitation in the Orthodox community, and we can talk both, in America and Israel. I assume that you're, centered around New York. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
no,
Yeah.
we're
So,
tri-state area based.
amazing. Right. So
Yes.
obviously, the two biggest, Orthodox communities or Jewish communities in the world, Israel and New York. Is the hesitation really because at some point, and I'm curious if you disagree with this classification, but it could almost be seen as a zero-sum game, meaning if I am not happy or there's something lacking from my life, and I talk to my rabbi about it, my rabbi might say, it's maybe because I am not learning enough, or maybe because, I'm not doing X enough in terms of my full potential as a, person of religion, versus if you go to a mental health counselor, they're probably not going to tell me, oh, it's because you slept through, shachri, just to translate for listeners, morning prayers for a couple of days in a row. Is that the tension, or is it something broader?
Um, I think it's a little bit that, but I think it's something broader than that. Um, you know, today, the knock on therapy, if you want to really be completely objective about it, is people claim the naysayers claim that therapy sort of coddles people's issues. Like you just mentioned, the sleeping through, chakras and whatnot, and whatever issue, quote unquote, someone has, therapy is taking a more coddling approach to that, and that's the knock on therapy. And obviously, the rabbi's perspective, and I think both have shifted. I think the rabbi's perspectives have shifted and the therapeutics perspective have become more sophisticated. Therapy is not always coddling anymore. The modalities are very all encompassing. The rabbis are not giving as much rebuke anymore, and they're more informed. So it's both have shifted. Therapy is not quite just pure analysis or pure CBT anymore, and just like either just analyzing everything and finding the origin, or giving you ways to, like, these sort of crude ways to think about things. Therapy's not just that anymore. It's very all encompassing, and the rabbis now, a lot of them are very, thanks to YouTube and TED Talks, and a lot of rabbis are mental health counselors and social workers and psychologists. They are very aware and informed, and they're not just doling out rebuke or advice for that matter. So yeah, so I mean, it's things have come a far, far away since people have been more willing to get help. And it's a hard call to know how to like where you're rebuking someone versus where you're coddling them versus where you're strategizing with them. There's so many things that come up in therapy that you have to really gauge. It's like an instrumental with a musician in an orchestra. You just have to have like a real court feel, a real intuition of like, you know, do I zone in on the client's resistance right now? Do I give them advice or a skill set? Do I analyze? A good therapist could sphere into all these domains. Again, there are all kinds of therapists. There are therapists who don't sphere, into these domains. There are therapists who just stay the course. But there are therapists who like to sphere into different domains, and those who do, you have to know when to do that. And again, clients are forgiving. You get it wrong, they forgive. There's therapies built in. There are ruptures, there are repairs. Things happen. It's a evolving dynamic, if you will. So yeah.
Amazing. So I wanted to zoom out a little bit. I'll give this sort of full disclosure. I'm not, of course, anti-therapy, but I'm maybe more, therapy skeptical, and I'll sort of, outline what I mean. And so you're the first mental health professional I've talked to on the podcast. I would love to, get your thoughts. There was a book by Abigail Schreier, who was a journalist. I don't know if you came across this. It was called
Of
Bad.
course, I know. Yes, of course.
So
Yeah,
so you can
she's
sort
a
of give.
legend. I'm a fan of hers.
You are a fan. So let me just give the 30-second Spark Notes version of your book, and then we can talk about, what she has right, what she has wrong. Her book, it's called Bad Therapy. I think it came out about a year ago. I'm just explaining this for listeners.
Yes, yes.
Not necessarily anti-therapy. She says that there is just an overuse of therapy, and that therapy is just becoming this all-encompassing thing where, now every single person in society, starting from the age of adolescence up to, 90s, is sort of supposed to be in therapy. And, I spend most of my time on a college campus, so I certainly hear people saying, everyone should be in therapy and things like that. And then she talks about the sort of overdiagnosis of mental health disorders, everything from, depression to anxiety to ADHD and, young boys. And these are all things that ring true to me in the sense of, I think every person in the history of the world knows what it's like to be stressed or anxious about something. But once go into some big office and have somebody that's dressed up fancy and that has some fancy title next to them and says, oh, that means you have anxiety, that can almost mean something different. So I'm curious, what you think of Abigail Schreier's book, why you like it as a therapist, and what she gets right, what she gets wrong.
Look, I think I'm a big fan of hers. I technically agree with her. I do think though that people on the outside, and this is I'm condoning this almost. I think people on the outside have to have a black and white outlook to a degree. They're not people from the inside fray, so they have a black and white outlook. I mean, if you asked me about accounting and what accountant could do what, I'm going to have a black and white outlook. I don't know the different shades of this one could do this and this one could do that. I mean, to a degree, yeah, but no. So the fact that she's a little black and white on it because she's tackling a different issue at her core, I respect that. That's piece one. Piece two, she is dead right. Therapy has been over weaponized today. Like you see everyone with the Stanleys, the cups, and that's therapy. There's the Stanley, there's the therapy. It's a fad. It's a trendy fad, and a trendy fad, much like a Stanley, there are people who need the Stanley and they need their cold water, and there are just people who have it as a prop. Not to give such a crude analogy, but therapy is the same way. People have it as a prop. They have it as a weaponization, a way to like ward off life. Oh, you ask them this, you ask them that, and they're in the workplace and they're like, oh, I have to ask my therapist. I don't know if I can do that. My therapist, this, my that. I mean, and that's where she's right. That's where she's definitely right. Now, where she is possibly in a black and white zone with this is, Growing up, and I could tell you this personally, I've been in many, A, in school, and B, in the synagogue, and wherever I've been. Okay, so starting in school, right? I've seen my friends who were struggling, and it was so glaring they had something, and they weren't diagnosed, and they weren't helped. Yes, did they limp through life, and were they resilient, and did they get through things? 100%. But they were struggling, and nothing was prescribed to them, not even medication, just diagnosis, no extra help, no extra anything. Are they set back today because of it? Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's one piece. And then you see in the synagogues, you have these, homeless people and strugglesome people. And then you hear on social media that these people died. A lot of them die young, and they live, and they're loners. So you have in life today it's for better and for worse. We are much more sophisticated. We are able to zone in and prescribe and diagnose problems. And people are healed because of it. Now, you want to say, then people are harmed because that diagnosis is being overprescribed. 100%. But I can attest, as someone coming from a mental health lens, that I could tell you decades on end that people were not diagnosed, and they're not alive anymore. I had this person in yeshiva. He was adopted, and he would dorm, and he was such a loner, and he had no friends. And what did we think of it? Like, okay, that's the way he is. That's his problem. That's just the way he is. He committed suicide. A true story. And honestly, if he would have been diagnosed at like 5, 7 years earlier that he is severely depressed, he has no social circle, he needs a therapist, he needs a social circle, would he have committed suicide? I'm not God, I can't tell you, but I can venture to say no. And again, I mean, I know I'm being bombastic, but I can carry on with examples, not even from my leadership, domain, but more just from my personal life, growing up with people and seeing. So that's where Abigail Schreier doesn't get it wrong, but she's looking at it from a little bit a healthy outsider's perspective, which again, I probably look at the whole transgender thing she's battling also with, and I like where she's coming from, but I'm also looking at her domain with an outsider's perspective, and that's the way the world works. So that's my thoughts.
No, definitely healthy. I'll ask you about, because you brought it up, I'll ask you in about 10 minutes about, transgenderism. I'm almost inclined, and I'm curious if you agree with this classification, just to wrap it up in a bow, that, there's sort of two different things that you can analogize therapy to. One is something, that everyone should do, say, exercise, right? So, it's safe to say everybody should be exercising, right? It's not safe to say that everybody should be getting back surgery, but if somebody needs back surgery, they really need back surgery. So would you say it's correct to, compare therapy more to the back surgery, right? Like, so nobody, it'd sort of be odd to say everyone should get back surgery, but it would also be odd to say I'm anti-back surgery, because you look around and there are some people who clearly their life would be better with back surgery. Do you like that sort of analogy?
It's not therapy is not back surgery. I'll put it on me. I work out. I work out. Why do I work out? Because I'm not naturally a specimen, and if I didn't work out, I'd be a problem. I would analogize that to therapy. Therapy is, if you have a predisposition to getting sad or getting ultra nervous, and literally because emotionally, you have a slow metabolism of sorts, like, just to bring the exercise piece back, then therapy is okay. But I mean, if you're fully intact, it's not like, there are people who they eat well, they live a healthy lifestyle, they're in shape, and they don't exercise. And that's where therapy is also. If you are fully intact, but not to be intact is not a problem either. Like, the fact that I do exercise doesn't create it. I don't look at myself as, damaged goods, God forbid. So anyone who's in therapy is, God forbid, not considered anything wrong with them. But it's not quite back surgery either. It's not like it's more it veers from essential, which you can say back surgery is, and intense, where the psychiatric intervention and whatnot. It veers there, and it starts at recreational as well. It begins at the recreational center point, and then it veers into something more serious, which is where mental health began. I mean, it began many moons ago with severe and persistently mentally ill, institutionalizing people and people being institutionalized, and it's come away from that. People don't realize that back in its infancy stage, there's many movies that discuss that, expose this, but the mentally ill were locked up and medicated, and that was it. Today we've gotten so sophisticated that people are so integrated into society with pretty much the same disorders. The bipolar ones and the schizophrenias didn't go anywhere. They didn't stop. It didn't, just like autism wasn't healed, this wasn't healed either. It wasn't eradicated. It exists, but we are much more sophisticated in dealing with it. Now, like you said originally, it's definitely over prescribed and over diagnosed. Not necessarily those disorders. Those glare very precisely, but the other things are overdiagnosed. 100% overdiagnosed. Yeah.
Yeah, no, 100%. And the comparison to exercise versus back surgery was more exercise is something that I do believe every single person should do versus not exercise. So it seems like, with therapy, you wouldn't necessarily say every person, no matter what, should be in therapy, a priori. If you have something you need to work through, then you go to therapy. But, a priori, there's no reason to, my 5-year-old kid, there's no reason why, barring anything that they need to work on, I should, put them into therapy. And that's very different than the way that a lot of parents, at least in more liberal circles, are raising their kids, where, I've talked to parents and, 5, 6, 7-year-old kids who have nothing obviously, discernibly wrong with them are going to consistent therapy. And there it seems a lot more general, right? It's not even, okay, you have X, Y, or Z issue, or, no matter how much I try, I always find myself gambling at the casino every Saturday night, which of course is a big problem and something that should be worked through therapy. But just as of course, this is, being proactive in protecting my child's mental health, sending them to therapy. And I think that's more what Abigail Schreier is writing on, that makes, a little bit less sense.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I agree with everything you said. It's exactly that. It's exactly that. The every kid should be in therapy is no good, according to this personal humble opinion. Um, but working, but being in therapy and working through something simple is a form of a sophisticated society also. So it's not quite when something's completely, in the insurance companies and the governing bodies really view, outpatient mental health as a form of preventative treatment. So what the way they view it, and I guess it's evidence based and whatnot, and their studies prove it, at least to them. And I see where they're going with this, because I run this operation that operates on this platform, is that they're looking at outpatient therapy as preventing institutionalization, hospitalization, medication. It's preventing something. And if you could foresee a problem on a trajectory, not because you're neglecting it as a parent, but if you foresee a glaring problem that there's just a clear predisposition to, that's what therapy is made for. That's what it is, exactly what it is, especially in the modern day. But if there is nothing, but you have to introspect as a parent first. You have to say, am I doing everything to put this kid on the best trajectory? You know what I mean? And you have to rule that out before you're like, oh, hey, he just needs therapy. She or he just needs therapy. That's it. That's it's neglectful, in my personal opinion. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
There's another interesting tension that I just wanted to name versus, you had mentioned before something about, disease or a problem and not, so I guess you have sort of two different views, which is, if therapy is a form of healthcare, it almost implies the thing that somebody has is, an illness or a disease. On the other hand, you don't want to stigmatize people who seek out mental health. So, there is a tension there. I was actually talking a couple podcasts ago to somebody about, the transgender community, somebody who identifies as, non-binary. And we sort of got into this rabbit hole a little bit where on the one hand, okay, in the trans community right now, one of the big, crises that they're undergoing is that the new administration is maybe not going to allow public, Medicare to fund transgender surgery. But in my mind, there's a little bit of a tension there because if transgenderism is not an illness, then Medicare shouldn't cover it. On the other hand, if it is an illness, then it should cover it, but that inherently stigmatizes it. So I'm curious if you come across this at all, right? Like, just another way to frame this, if somebody has, anxiety or depression or autism, there are a lot of people that would be offended to say that autism is a disease or is an illness to be fixed. On the other hand, those same people would probably want there to be medical dollars, right, going towards working with people with autism. So there is a real tension there. And I'm curious if you rub against this just in everyday life.
Yeah, I do. And I'll add to your point. I'll add, there are people in the world who are, and we deal with them in mental health, who, there are two camps of people. There are widows and widowers, and then divorced people. And the divorced people have a great gripe that they don't get the pity that the widows and widowers get, and they're correct. They're not at fault for being divorced. There was a life mishap. Um, now, now it's not quite that they want to be, labeled, but they want like an awareness and an empathy that's subtle and muted and classy. Mental health, there are people in mental health, and there's this dichotomy you're talking about. There are people in mental health who, yes, there's the camp that doesn't want to be labeled, and there's the camp that is like, wait a second, someone is has cancer or is a cancer survivor. They have like this lording world empathy, and they're lauded, and the mental health survivors are just like there's like this like kind of like peripheral like corner of the eye like, oh, could that have been self-inflicted or something? And it's so incorrect that that mental health is ever self-inflicted. It's as self-inflicted as cancer, which there's no proof that that's self-inflicted. So that is a gripe that the mental health community has. But by the same token, they don't want the pity with a stamp and a diagnosis. They want what the cancer survivor has, which is they don't get a stamp of like a problem. That's like the middle ground that mental health is looking for. It's the middle ground that people who suffered divorces are looking for. They're looking for like a little bit of forgivingness from society that they've gone through a hard time. And honestly, we should be smart enough today to not pity people. They don't want to be pitied, but to empathize with people who have gone through a struggle. I think trans people kind of want that as well. I don't know. I'm sure with, like in the feminist camps, there are all these sub camps. I'm sure in the trans camps, there are sub camps who really just want the appropriate awareness and understanding. I don't know if we hear about those people. There are, Barry Weiss brought on her podcast.
Brianna Bloom.
Yes, and she really put forth that that kind of perspective, and that was a very when you hear her talk, you're like, yeah, what's there not to get or understand? It's fine, okay, it's so if everyone was, and okay, it's very hard to ask people to be so homogenous. Also, I get that too. That's the other side of it. But if they were the front runners of messaging for this, I think those groups of people would. It's hard to say if they'd be more accepted, but I would say they would be more. This would be more palpable to the greater society. I would say. I would believe they should be. Feel for everybody, So
No,
yes.
I 100% agree with you. Just to flag for listeners, Brianna Wu, if they, people aren't familiar with them, they should definitely, Google the name. And I think just the point that Brianna makes is that, there's sort of two separate fights going on within the trans activist community. One is that they're just treated as individuals with respect and, treat people according to, proper pronouns, which, is all great and fine. If I told you, please don't call me Daniel, call me Dan, you shouldn't say no, but your legal name is, it's whatever. On the other hand, her point is that the trans activist community has sort of overstepped and now is trying to imagine that, categories such as sex don't even exist and is all just sort of this, fabrication made up by, the hierarchies that be. I don't want to get us down that rabbit hole because I have a couple
Right.
of questions for
Yeah.
you. We
Sure,
live in
sure.
sort of, there's sort of a paradox that we're in right now. And there's some people give simple answers to answer this paradox, but I'm curious to throw it to you. We're obviously, in a material sense, living at probably the best time in human history. People that live in America in 2025 are almost certainly doing better, both in the Jewish community and, in the wider secular community than at any other point in history, in terms of everything one can imagine: safety, material wealth, access to food, access to, hygiene. Yet rates of depression, anxiety, and loneliness are at really all-time highs. I mean, what do you think accounts for this, huge discrepancy?
Yeah, it sounds like a hard question, but it's an easy question. You know, if someone is too wealthy, their life, their money is monopoly money and their life is a monopoly game. When you have too much and you don't have ways to keep the too much in check, everything just loses meaning, and people, when they lose perspective of how good we have it, everything good loses meaning. So what something has to gain. If you're alive on this earth, you have to have some meaning, and that meaning can become, you know, trivial sometimes and overly nuanced and overly tangential and overly everything. And the we have everything we need in this society, um, and that creates sometimes some form of over microing and over magnification of problems that maybe shouldn't be as big or as grand as they are, but because there are no actual issues, those issues become bigger issues. That's one end of that. But the other end of it is that, unfortunately, I hate to say this, as much as we do have, society is unfortunately very hateful, very unforgiving, very ruthless. Wherever society gets ahead, they get ahead, and there's no turning back. Such a silly thing. I'm in New York, and they just instituted this congestion pricing, and the entire New York despises this thing. And you know what? And people they're trying to make ends meet. It really bites the middle class terribly, and it's so not figured out, and it's really not worked through, and you know a vulnerable person gets angry and gets sad by that stuff, and no one pinches themselves to say, you know does crime go up when we make people upset like this? Maybe. Oh no, no, just people are bad and they're evil. True, they are, but on the other end, you pull things like this and you keep choking out society like this, and then this is just a prime tangible example. There's 1,000 examples of where, like, things just get harder and harder and harder and harder and harder. And yes, you want to say inflation to some degree was organic, and it was, and circumstantial. Fair enough. But congestion pricing was not organic and circumstantial. It was very manufactured. It was a money grab. Um, we already are flooded with cameras all over the place that don't improve anyone's safety, but it generates revenue. And everybody came to peace with, the city needs the money. So that's fine. We get it. City has to survive. Okay, but that only gave birth to now congestion prices. City needs more money. So at what point? And we have no control over this, and this makes people upset. Now, society is ridden with all of these kind of sort of accoutrements, and that makes people upset. So as good as we have it, there's that side of it, and people are vulnerable and they're poor and they're suffering, and these things hurt them. They hurt them, and that's where we don't always have everything we have, even if we think we do. So there are two sides to that, you know.
Do you have strong opinions just in your expertise about social media?
Um, no, no, I don't. I don't have strong opinions. It could be because my kids are young, and so you know, you get strong opinions when they bite you first degree. When they don't bite you first degree, you don't formulate an opinion so crisply on it. You know, I don't have such strong opinions about it. I don't. I probably should hate it more than I do. I don't. And maybe I'll hate it when my kids grow up and are a victim of it of sorts. But right now they're not necessarily a victim of social media, so you know I don't really hate it.
Well,
Maybe I
I
should
think
though.
even
Yeah.
just reflecting, I mean, you use the term victim of social media, so that already implies some amount of skepticism. But I guess, we can, just the last question I wanted to ask, and then I'm happy to give it to you if there's
Yes.
something we didn't address just in terms of your specific work. This has sort of been my pet issue for personal reasons, and I'll sort of give the 2-minute story. I've never actually told the story on the podcast, so you and the listeners can be the first. But I want to talk a little bit about, young boys and the overdiagnosis of ADHD, and this is a personal issue of mine because when I was 4 or 5 or 6, I was diagnosed with ADHD along with, hordes of other boys, and I was given some super high dose of Concerta, which is some, type of Ritalin like drug. And it immediately just, cut my appetite. And, I wasn't social at all. And, again, you're hyper focused, but it basically, I was on this for a couple of years. And then at some point in middle school, I don't remember why, but I just decided myself I'm gonna, stop taking this for a couple months. And of course, that was a disaster. I got in trouble, I got whatever. My grades were bad. But then within a couple months, I basically just learned to live with, I guess just having more energy and less attention span than everyone else. And, I've never looked back. And from so much of what I read, especially with, the education system, it's very much not geared towards young boys. There is this sort of super high diagnosis of ADHD in young boys. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about that. Is that something that you see, and what are your sort of general thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's something I see a lot. It's a sort of fast track way of parenting, A in the home and B in the school setting. It's a broad stroke mentality. Um, a lot of these institutions, we see this all over in this country. They don't calibrate so quickly. It takes a lot of advocacy and policy shifts, you know, to calibrate. I know for a fact I was a therapist one on one for a kid many moons ago who on medication couldn't focus for not a minute, not 1 minute, not one, and he was medicated. That's ADHD. It's a real thing. Um, Somebody who is a tad learning disabled, a tad distracted, a tad regressed. Um, you don't you're dealing with people's brain structures and side effects and everything. Medication, I'm very conservative. You should not medicate kids in a whim. You give them TLC, you zone in on them, you work with them, you reach them emotionally. It's a lot of work. You have to give more of yourself to not medicate a kid. That's the truth. That is the truth. But that should be the way schools operate. It should be the way the parents operate. It shouldn't just be um, like a coffee in the morning, you know, like a wake up, like a jolt, a good jolt, you know, like, oh, I get my coffee. You're an adult, coffee, that's fine. But for kids, that's you shouldn't treat the ADHD medication like a coffee jolt, you know, like, oh yeah, you know, you just need to reset the kid. That's not fair to him. You reset the kid by methodically, like reaching him. That's been my, we have psychiatrists by me, and we pay them a hefty penny, and it's in my, on one hand, it's in my best interest that they're filled up and they have clients, but I always, anytime people ask me, I always have a more like it's a last resort. You have to rule out everything before you just that's always my advice. Again, the parents still reign supreme over the situation, but my advice is always like if they're willing to hear it, it's always like, no, have you done everything? Have you tried everything? If you haven't, and there are here and there parents who are very open to trying. There are some conservative-minded parents when it comes to medication, but we're not. I don't like preaching. Yeah, yeah, just medicate the kid. And I'm very therapy. I'm very therapy focused. I always say therapy is not masking a problem. Medication is, and that's the way.
I feel the same
Now,
way about
yeah.
like, SSRIs. I'm imagining many people, listening to this are on some form of SS just because, I work on campus. I, meet with hundreds of students a year and I'm always shocked by the number of people. And I always, again, I don't want to, never in a one-on-one setting am I going to, push somebody personally on their medication choice. But in a general sense, I've had, by now hundreds of conversations with people over the last 8 years I've been on campus that tell me something about, some antidepressant or anxiety meds. And I start to ask, I'm like, okay, what have you tried before getting on this drug? Have you tried to, get outdoors more, get more sunlight, change your diet, all the common sense things that one should do. And a lot of times it's, no, my psychiatrist said, oh, start with this and we'll up the dose if you need. And, you had mentioned before, the incentive structures are all off. It turns out basically everyone in my, immediate friend group are either doctors or dentists of some capacity. So I, have these conversations all the time with them. But I'm wondering, I mean, would you tell the same thing if somebody has, minor symptoms? I'm not talking about, debilitating of, you can't get out of your bed, but, minor symptoms of depression or anxiety, is there a whole set of things they should try to do, like, at home, quote unquote, fix of lifestyle changes before they hop on, a pharmaceutical?
I Yes, if they're not under the care of a psychiatrist, because I wouldn't want to step on their toes. If they're pre that psychiatric care, I would definitely, like you said, if there are minor symptoms, I would tell them, try A, B, C, and D. Organic things like sunlight and recreation and therapy if needed, and those more innocuous things than to go the medication route. Um, just one piece on that. I have a whole wave of psychiatrists now have come through the pipeline by me who they come to me and they moonlight at the company. They do this like part time, as they're finishing their residency. And what I've noticed more recently is they're becoming very sophisticated in one respect, in many respects, but in this specific, very beneficial respect, they are starting to realize that what they call biological psychiatry, is not the only form. So what they'll do is a lot of them will go to training institutes, psychoanalytic training institutes. So what they'll do is they'll really, really absorb the analytic, dynamic, and theories. So when they're trying to get a read on a patient, they understand it much deeper than just like a biological problem in the brain, but they're understanding it from a dynamic standpoint. So which allows them not to be just black and white conservative on medication, but to really have an understanding of like, is this like, could there be something else done aside from medicating? There is more to the problem than just a biological chemical imbalance. There is more. What's more, there is an emotional piece, and there is so that's been a nice breakthrough I've seen with my cohort of psychiatrists.
Yeah, no, and I think it's interesting because it touches on a wider problem within the medical community where people are so hyper specialized that if they're trained to do one thing, they're going to always see that as a solution. Just for full disclosure, my wife is a surgical resident, training at UC Irvine, and we always talk about how, the overprescription of surgery, in people that probably could, obviously there are some people who clearly need surgery, but then there's other times where, okay, you tweak your shoulder and, you could do, 5 months of physical therapy and fix it. But a lot of times an orthopedic surgeon will say, it's better to just get the surgery, even if, the data doesn't actually bear that out, just because that's their specialty. That's what they do. And so I'd imagine there's a similar trade-off. Okay, we've been talking for a while. I'm curious, are there any other things, both general or specifically to the work you do with the Orthodox community that we haven't addressed?
No, I think we've covered most of it. The Orthodox community they're bashful. They don't always they're bashful in a nice sense. They don't always they want to be discreet about the issue, and maybe that's contributed to the stigma or resistance to therapy over the years. But um, they're society has integrated so nicely in many respects, and the Orthodox community has really come around very starkly in being very at peace with therapy as much as they're at peace with modern medicine. So they've come a long way. It's a big breakthrough. Mental health is something that has recently become very accepted in that community. Yeah, with its own trimmings and hangups, but it's come a long way. It's not perfect, but it's really come a long way.
Amazing. Well, if people want to learn more, you can just Google Pesach Tikvah and you'll get the website is the first thing there. Yerachmiel Stern, thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.